Chapter 25. The Fire's Reflection. It started with the fire, not the cold or the strange silence, or even the way the forest seemed to lean in closer with every passing hour, but the fire, that simple flickering blaze that had always been the centerpiece of so many camping nights, now suddenly wrong in a way no one could immediately define. It burned normally at first, crackling with that familiar cadence, spitting amber sparks into the dark like harmless fireflies, its orange glow painting the nearby trunks in warm hues. But as the night deepened and the shadows pressed in tighter, something changed in the way the flames moved, something subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a skipped beat in a song you knew by heart. And then it shifted again. And when Liza happened to glance down into the fire's reflection, she froze completely, the beer bottle slipping from her hand and rolling into the dirt with a soft clink that no one else seemed to notice. At first, she wasn't sure what she was seeing. The reflection looked like her. It had her hair, her jacket, her posture, even the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when listening. But the expression on the face was wrong. Not just blank or mismatched, but malicious, as though the thing sitting across from her in the fire's mirrored glow was someone who had grown up learning all of her movements, memorizing her smallest reactions, and had only now chosen to reveal that it had always been pretending. Her reflections smiled slowly, not in a way that invited connection, but in the deliberate, drawn-out way a predator shows teeth. The corners of its mouth rose just a little too far. She blinked hard and looked up. Everyone else around the campfire was laughing, trading exaggerated stories about terrible exes and bad camping meals, their voices rising over the steady crackle of the flames. She shook her head once, forcing herself to look back down into the fire, and found nothing unusual. Her reflection sat where it should, following her movements perfectly, wearing her face without any trace of that earlier malice. For a moment, she wondered if she had simply imagined it, a trick of the flames, a trick of her brain, a shadow misplaced. But then something moved again, and this time she wasn't the only one who noticed. "I swear I just saw myself blink before I did," Tyler said, his voice caught between amusement and unease, his face illuminated in flickering orange light. He leaned forward, poking at the fire with a stick. "Not a mirror delay, like it was ahead of me." "That's what I'm saying," Liza murmured. "It's not just shadows. Look again." Morgan snorted from across the circle, huddled in a too large hoodie, arms wrapped around her knees. "You guys are being weird. It's fire. Fire moves. You're just seeing patterns because your brains want there to be patterns." "No," Tyler said slowly, now squinting into the coals. "No, it's more than that. It's not just movement. It's—" He stopped mid-sentence, eyes fixed on something in the flames. Then he recoiled slightly. "Okay, that was messed up." Liza leaned toward him. "What?" "My reflection," he said, voice tight. "It didn't smile. It grinned, like huge, like it knew I was watching." Morgan rolled her eyes, but the motion felt too slow, too practiced, like someone performing exasperation rather than feeling it. She reached for the marshmallow bag and shoved it toward them, but her gaze lingered just a second too long on the fire. There were 5 of them on this trip: Liza, Tyler, Morgan, Jace, and Danny, all friends from university, now scattered across states, but reunited for the long weekend. They had driven out to the national park that morning, hiked 5 miles off the main trail, and set up camp in a place no one else was likely to find. It was peaceful at first, almost idyllic, the air crisp and cool, the sky a perfect blanket of indigo and stars. But by nightfall, after the tents were staked and the food eaten, the fire had begun to act strange. Jace hadn't said much yet. He was quiet by nature, slow to speak, the kind of person whose silence often went unnoticed until it lingered too long. Now he stared openly at the flames, unmoving, his hands resting on his thighs, his pupils wide. "Jace?" Liza said. "You okay?" He didn't blink. "Jace?" He flinched as if waking from a dream. His head turned to her, movements stiff. Yeah, just tired. But something about his tone was off, too flat, too practiced. Liza found herself leaning away without thinking. More hikers, campers, park rangers, men and women, old and young, all of them quiet, expressionless. They formed a circle around Avery. He stood slowly. "Why me?" he asked. Cam tilted his head. "You stayed." Jules nodded. "You looked back." Another voice spoke, a child's voice. "You heard your own cry." Avery turned to the center of the circle. There stood the version of himself again, no longer crying, but smiling faintly, eyes calm. "You broke the loop," the copy said. "You left grief. You passed through it." Avery blinked. "So I'm free?" The copy stepped forward. "No, you're chosen." The figures raised their hands. The forest dimmed. Avery's body locked in place. He could no longer move, but he was not afraid. The air around him thickened, and with it came knowledge. Not speech, not thought, but memory. The voices were not curses, they were warnings. The mourners were not ghosts, they were guides. Every hiker who had disappeared, every camper who had vanished, had not died in the traditional sense. They had become part of the forest's memory, emissaries of grief, guardians of the place where reality thinned and sorrow took shape. They marked others not to doom them, but to prepare them, to bring them here, to continue the lament. And Avery, having heard his own cry, having walked through the spiral and returned, was no longer a visitor. He was a keeper. The forest would now weep through his voice, and someday, when the next hiker stepped too far off the trail, too deep into the old woods, they would hear Avery's sobs through the trees, soft, sad, steady. And they would not understand. Not yet, but they would. Liza sat motionless in her sleeping bag, the inside of her tent cold and damp, her ears straining against the quiet as though silence itself had become suspect. She hadn't dared unzip the flap yet, not after what she thought she had seen, or dreamed, or perhaps hallucinated in the moments just before waking. But the fire had still been burning, of that she was certain. There had been no rustling of movement, no sounds of sticks cracking underfoot, no voices from her friends, no jokes or groans or sleepy curses to mark a restless night. Only that strange persistence of flame, quietly smoldering outside like an unattended thought that refused to fade, and the dark shapes, just barely visible in the orange glow, sitting in a circle around the fire in impossible stillness. She pressed her ear gently to the wall of the tent and waited. A breeze passed through the trees, dislodging a few pine needles above, but there were no footsteps, no whispers. Just the low, undisturbed sound of coals breathing heat into the morning fog. Finally, driven by the need to know, she unzipped the tent in small, slow movements, easing it open with deliberate care. The forest outside was still draped in early light, a pale mist curling low across the earth, and the fire pit was indeed alive, crackling with embers and the occasional flutter of flame, despite no one having added wood since the previous night. That alone was impossible. Liza emerged cautiously, heart racing, eyes sweeping the campsite. Tyler's tent was zipped shut. Morgan's too. Jace's was collapsed halfway, as though someone had tried to take it down in the dark and stopped midway. Danny's, closest to the tree line, stood oddly rigid, like something inside was propping it open from within. She took a step toward the fire. The circle of stones was undisturbed, the logs they had sat on now damp with dew. She crouched, peering into the center, and for the second time in 12 hours the breath left her chest. Reflected in the fire's core were 5 people.
They sat perfectly still, their faces warped and dark, as though carved from coal and glass, all of them positioned just beyond the reach of the visible flame. She saw herself there, unmistakable in outline and shape, but hollow-eyed and slack-jawed, her arms folded too precisely across her knees. The figure next to her had to be Tyler, though his jaw was unhinged slightly, and one eye gleamed in a way that reminded her of a dying flashlight. Morden's reflection grinned too broadly, her lips stretching unnaturally as if they had forgotten how human mouths worked. Liza backed away, stumbling over her own boots. She turned sharply toward the tents and called out, trying to keep her voice level. "Guys, you up?" No answer. She moved to Tyler's tent and unzipped the flap. It was empty. His sleeping bag was still there, half unzipped, his backpack upright and unopened. A few of his things, headlamp, notebook, water bottle, were scattered across the floor as though he had left in a hurry. She checked the others. Danny's tent was empty. So was Morgan's. Jace's lay in a heap, the poles snapped in half, the fabric flattened into the moss. No footprints led away from the camp, no trail of disturbed foliage, no sign that anything or anyone had moved through the undergrowth. They had simply vanished. Liza turned back to the fire, now burning more brightly than before, the reflections seeded more clearly, their features sharpening. She saw her double blink slowly and turn her head to look directly at her, as if aware now that she was watching. She did the only thing she could think to do. She ran. Not toward the trailhead, which she knew was miles away, but into the woods, into the arms of whatever direction would carry her farthest from the fire, from those impossible reflections, from the campsite that had become some kind of stage for a silent invasion. Her boots snapped twigs beneath her, branches scraped her arms and face, but she didn't stop. The trees thickened, the light changed, and somewhere between one step and the next, the landscape shifted in a way that felt both gradual and sudden. She emerged into a clearing she didn't remember seeing before. It was wide and circular, almost perfect in its symmetry, and in its center stood a single tree, tall and skeletal, its bark scorched, its branches reaching out like the hands of something drowned. Around the base of the tree were fragments of stone, weathered and half-buried, marked with patterns she didn't recognize. And there, embedded in the base of the trunk like a wound that refused to close, burned a fire. It wasn't made of wood. The fire there burned in a bowl of glass and bone, and its flames moved too slowly, each tongue of light writhing like a tendril searching for purchase. But it gave off no heat, no smoke, only light, and within that light, Liza saw her friends, not in the flesh, but in the fire's reflection.
They sat together, unmoving, their faces calm and serene, no longer twisted or grotesque, but distant like statues carved from the idea of memory. She stepped closer, drawn by the gravity of it, compelled by the need to understand, to see. And as she did, a whisper touched her mind, not with words, but with sensations. Warmth, belonging, relief. The voices followed a moment later. "We are safe here," said Tyler, though his mouth never moved. "You don't have to run anymore," murmured Morgan. Jace smiled faintly. "They showed us what we could be." Danny opened her arms, not to embrace, but to invite. Liza looked down again and saw herself standing in the circle, reflected not in fire now, but in the curved surface of the glass bowl itself. She was already among them, already seated beside her twisted reflection. "You have to choose," said a voice that came from nowhere and everywhere, not spoken aloud, but pressed directly into her mind. "The fire cannot burn what is whole. It can only take the parts you let go of." Liza staggered back, her body suddenly heavy. Something was wrong with her legs, her arms. They moved slower now, as though underwater. The forest blurred at the edges, the light dimmed behind her eyes. It wasn't trying to kill her. It was welcoming her. The realization nearly brought her to her knees. The fire did not replace them. It did not consume them. It seduced them, offered them a vision of peace, of unity, of perfection, twisted though it was, and then it pulled them into a mirror world where everything looked the same, but none of it belonged. The versions she had seen were not invaders. They were echoes, reflections cast backward through the veil, waiting for the real people to give up and step through. And one by one, her friends had surrendered. She didn't know how long she stood there, trembling, the wind passing through her hair, the fire humming softly in the still air. But at some point, she realized she was no longer alone. A shape emerged from the other side of the clearing. It had her face, but it was not her. The thing that stepped forward moved with gentle certainty, its eyes serene, its smile warm. It wore her clothes, her skin, her scars, but none of it was hers. And behind it, more figures came. Tyler, Morgan, Danny, Jace. Each one carrying the same expression, the same peace, the same stillness of spirit that made Liza's heart thunder with dread. "We are not what you fear," her reflection said, and its voice was hers in every note. "We are what remains after fear is gone." Liza turned to run, but her legs buckled. Her knees hit the ground with a crack. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," her copy said. "Just let go." The fire behind her roared to life, and in its center 5 more figures began to form, each one reaching out, each one smiling, each one waiting. Liza closed her eyes and screamed. Liza's scream tore through the clearing like a signal flare, not loud enough to shake the forest, but sharp enough to remind her that her voice still belonged to her, that the lungs drawing breath into her chest were her own, that the heartbeat slamming against her ribs came not from whatever this was, this place, this fire, these things in her skin, but from her. The figures before her flinched, not backward, but forward, like the scream had acted as a permission, a cracking of some invisible shell that now allowed them to come closer. Her reflection took a single step toward her, arms outstretched not with malice, but with serenity, which somehow was worse. "We only want you whole," it said softly, and Liza felt the words vibrate in her teeth and fingertips. Her knees were still sunk into the dirt, damp and cold and trembling. Her arms felt leaden, and her vision was dimming at the edges, the fire's unnatural glow painting everything in hues of amber and violet, like bruised sunset. But beneath the hum of the flame, beneath the pull of her own doppelganger's impossible calm, something in her stirred. Not a thought, not even a memory, but instinct, raw, animal, ancient. Not fight, and not flight either, but rupture, the innate refusal to be consumed, the awareness that whatever stood before her, mimicking her, wearing her shape like a costume, could never truly become her unless she surrendered. And she would not surrender. Liza lunged. Her body moved without plan or grace, and she crashed into her reflection with enough force to knock both of them backward toward the base of the scorched tree. For a moment the two of them tangled in a heap, a grotesque mirror folding in on itself, and she could feel the thing's skin. It was not cold, not wet, not anything she expected, but dry and too soft, like leather cured wrong, stretched over something brittle and hollow. Her hands locked around its throat and squeezed. The reflection did not fight. It did not struggle or resist. It simply looked at her, eyes wide, lips trembling in something too close to pity. "This is not the way," it whispered. But Liza snarled and slammed its head into the trunk of the tree, once, twice, a third time. The skin split, but it did not bleed.
Instead, something black and fibrous spilled from the gash, like burned hair and spider silk knotted together, writhing and dry, a soundless mass of clotted memory and rot. She gagged as the thing shivered beneath her, its face warping, its features slipping, its mouth stretching open to an impossible shape, not to scream, but to pull, like a vacuum made of hunger. She let go just as a whip of that fibrous mass lashed up toward her face, nicking her cheek. Instantly she felt something inside her mind twitch, a flicker of warmth, of surrender, of the fire's offer. But she clamped her teeth and drove her boot into the reflection's chest, shoving it back against the tree. The other reflections had begun to move now. Tyler's twisted double reached for her with clawed fingers that had not been claws a moment ago. Danny's doppelganger opened its mouth and let loose a sound not unlike her voice, but flipped inside out, every syllable reversed and disjointed, as though some great engine was chewing on the shape of her name. Liza scrambled back to the fire, her eyes locked on the central bowl of bone and glass. The flames were rising higher now, revealing not just the reflections, but the threads that connected them. Dozens of black fibrous cords extended from the base of the fire into the forest beyond, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. Each cord twisted off toward where her friends had vanished, and now she understood. They had not simply been replaced, they had been anchored. Their images in the fire were not passive echoes, they were the roots of something trying to grow into the real world, and the fire was the gate. Liza seized a stone from the ground, its edges sharp and wet with moss. Without thinking, without ceremony, she hurled it directly into the fire's center. The impact shattered the bowl. Glass and bone exploded outward, and the fire let out a howl, no longer a sound of warmth or invitation, but rage, shrill and primal like a wounded animal that had finally been seen for what it truly was. The figures screamed in unison, not the copies, the real ones. Tyler's voice shrieked from the woods, Morgan's voice crying no in a way that cracked the air, and Jace, Jace let out a sound like someone being burned alive. Liza fell to her knees, hands clamped over her ears. The fire's remnants twisted upward like writhing roots, the cords snapping one by one, spraying hot, wet bursts of whatever ichor had fueled the illusions. The tree split.
Not down the middle, but outward like a blister rupturing, and from within its hollow core something massive and coiled uncurled itself. It had no face, no eyes, but it had mouths, dozens of them, lining its inner body like lampreys, each one whispering some half-language, offering bargains, promises, names. Its flesh was layered and soft and wrong, like fungus grown over meat, and it towered above her now, firelight burning beneath its semi-translucent skin. It was not a creature. It was a machine of memory and reflection. It did not live. It remembered, and it wanted her. She turned and ran. The forest was no longer just forest. It had warped, trees bending at unnatural angles, their bark rippling like muscle, leaves twitching like insects. Every root threatened to trip her, every branch clawed at her face. But she ran anyway, through pain, through exhaustion, through the screams of her friends that came from nowhere and everywhere. Behind her, the thing gave chase, not with limbs or legs, but with presence, folding the world toward it, turning every step into a question. Who are you, Liza? What do you reflect? What will you give? She broke through a thicket and found herself, suddenly, impossibly, back at the original campsite. The fire pit was cold, the tents were still up, but her friends were there, seated, unmoving, faces empty, bodies upright. And in the center, a new fire had begun to burn, just embers for now. Liza stepped into the circle and looked down. The reflections in this new fire were clear, too clear. She saw Morgan first. Her smile was wrong. Then Tyler, one eye hanging loosely in its socket, grinning like a corpse that didn't know it was dead. Danny, her mouth stitched closed by ash. Jace, his hands rubbing together like he was washing them in invisible blood. And finally, herself. Perfect, still, watching. Not twisted, not monstrous, just waiting. Then her reflection raised one hand and pointed, not at her, behind her. Liza turned just in time to see the tendrils of the ruptured tree thing reaching through the canopy, threading between trunks, its mouths opening in unison. But it wasn't reaching for her anymore. It was reaching for the fire, to rebuild, to re-anchor. It did not need her consent anymore. She had broken its gate. Now it would make another. Her reflection in the flames smiled, and Liza understood with terrible clarity that she had not destroyed anything. She had only woken it up. She reached for a broken tent pole, wrapped her hands around the sharpened end, and drove it through her own chest. The forest screamed, the fire hissed and went dark, and the reflection in the embers flickered once, twice, before collapsing into ash. The thing in the trees convulsed, then retreated, dragged back into its hollow, and the forest was still for now. But in the black glass of the shattered firebowl, a single image remained. A face, not Liza's, yours, smiling, waiting, ready.
Thank you for listening to this story. Your support means a lot and helps keep these tales coming. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to subscribe and follow for more dark and immersive stories just like this one. New horrors await. Don't miss what's coming next.